This episode is part 2 of the serial killer file on Robert Pickton. For the first episode, please see the description below. She was a pig, so I butchered her like a pig. These are the words of the blood-soaked killer caught in the act of skinning and dismembering a woman. He was given many names: Pighead Killer, Pork Chop Rob, the Pig Farm Killer. No matter the name, heinous doesn't begin to describe the depth of the crimes perpetrated by Robert Willie Pickton. His hunting along the streets of Vancouver left a mark so deep it still echoes today. And yet it was a lack of action and abysmal failure on the part of law enforcement of Vancouver and of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that allowed the pig farm killer free rein of the streets to hunt with abandon among the vulnerable women who worked and lived in the downtown East Side. Tonight we will discuss the eventual capture of Robert Pickton and the full scope of his horrific actions. Let's open the serial killer file. This episode is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Lynn Ellingson found herself face to face with the mutilated corpse of a woman hanging on a meat hook, a woman whom, only hours earlier, had been very much alive and talking to her. Willie Pickton was covered in the butchered woman's blood. The deranged Pickton grabbed hold of Lynn and he made her look at the ruined body dangling above the ground. What he told her was that if she said anything, she would be right there on that hook, too. Panicked, Lynn blurted out that she wanted money for drugs and alcohol, and that if she had that, she wouldn't tell anyone. Perhaps Willie had formed some sort of attachment during Lynn's time as his roommate. Perhaps his bloodlust had simply been sated for the night. Whatever the reason, Pickton let Lynn go. He even went so far as to pay for her cab back to Vancouver. Lynn kept Pickton's secret even when an informant tipped off police after hearing the story, and they brought her in for an interview. She denied everything that happened that night. Like many of the women who dwelled in the dark streets of Vancouver, she distrusted police, and she likely felt guilt and responsibility in helping to lure a woman to her death. It would take over 3 years before Lynn Ellingson would recount what she saw to the authorities. Even though the painted red toes of Willie's victim would never be far from her mind, little did she know just what horrors were unfolding at Pickton's farm, and just how lucky she was to escape in one piece. Marnie Lee Frey's selflessness is something she was well known for. She would give anything she had to someone in need, even if that left her with nothing. Marnie's father, Rick Frey, was never certain what she would be wearing when she came through the door after a long day of school. Her father is quoted as saying, "You would ask her where her jacket was, and she would say, 'Oh, my friend didn't have one, so I gave her mine.' That was just the kind of girl she was." Unfortunately, Marnie was exposed to drugs through a gang, and her addiction pulled her away from the quiet life she had in Campbell River, and brought her to the streets of Vancouver, where she would support her drug habit by working in the sex trade. Despite her addiction, Marnie would call home sometimes as much as 8 times a day to check in on her young daughter, Brittany. Her last call came in the fall of 1997, when Marnie spoke to her stepmother to talk about her birthday and make arrangements to pick up the care package that they were sending her. The call ended with the two exchanging "I love yous," but Marnie would never call back again. It would be the streets of the downtown East Side where she would become one of the women who ran into Robert Pickton, perhaps treating him with the same sort of compassion she showed all things and people, a compassion that Pickton had no intention of returning. He butchered her to the point that her body was viciously destroyed. She was dismembered and her meat was ground up the same way Pickton did with his pigs. Only a partial jawbone would later be discovered on the farm. The last remnants of a caring woman. Even with what he did to her body, Pickton could not destroy the love of Marnie's family. When her stepmother tried to report Marnie missing, she was told to call back in a few days. She called the police in October and November, but a missing persons file was not opened until December, over 3 months since she had last been seen. The Vancouver police refused to accept her disappearance as a missing person simply because Marnie had been active in the sex trade. Blatant police failures triggered by systemic bias against the poor, vulnerable women of Vancouver's downtown east side allowed a serial killer to evade arrest, and his monstrous lust would not be quenched by simply extinguishing the light of Marnie Lee Frey. He was far, far from finished. Lust was something which Pickton knew all too well. Outside of his visits to the drug-strewn streets of Vancouver, Robert and his brother Dave opened a bar that they chose to name Piggy's Palace, though calling it a bar was being generous. The long tin shed was a place of near-constant parties for Robert and Dave Pickton, as well as the bikers they had become associated with. It had been constructed as a non-profit society dedicated to raising money for sports organizations and other worthy groups. This was not often the case, as the drug and alcohol-fueled events would devolve into orgies with many sex workers in attendance. However, they weren't the only ones who came to these parties, as Piggy's Palace was visited by almost everyone in Port Coquitlam. Business owners and city council members would frequent the bar, and there were even more average events like the Halloween Bash, where kids came in costume, a surface of innocence that did not deter the activities that took place at the bar, the same as any other night. The one fixture that remained constant at these functions was a whole pig roasted on a spit. One attendee to such an event remarked about Pickton's odd eating habits, saying, "I was about to eat the pig, but when I saw him tearing it apart with his hands, I decided not to. His hands were dirty." This was a smart move, as it would later be revealed that one of Pickton's preferred methods of body disposal was to feed the remains of murdered women to his pigs. A large portion of Port Coquitlam would later be horrified to learn that they had feasted on pigs that had consumed human corpses. Pickton was a disorganized killer, as sloppy with his murders as he was while eating. He never truly hid what he was doing, even going so far as to tell one acquaintance by the name of Andrew Bellwood how to best deal with a hooker. Willie mimed handcuffing a woman and stroking her hair before reaching under the mattress to pull out a cord and proceeding to act out how he would strangle his victim. Another man named Scott Chubb, formerly employed by the Pickton family as a truck driver, would later testify that Willie had told him a good way to kill a female heroin addict was to inject her with windshield washer fluid. A friend of Pickton's named Lisa Yelds would clean his trailer for him. She grew suspicious upon finding many women's belongings among his things, but as a cop-hating biker, she only shared those suspicions with her stepbrother. Yelds once relayed how she'd seen bloody clothing inside Pickton's trailer and pieces of identification for as many as 10 women. Her stepbrother passed on the information to police. However, they needed to hear it directly from Lisa in order to get a search warrant. Lisa's stepbrother called back multiple times in 1999, but law enforcement retaining their record of negligence, never got in contact with him again. Further confirmation of the presence of women's clothing was brought up in the interview with Lynn Ellingson, who would call Pickton a weird guy and recounted how he would dress in women's clothing. Occasionally, Pickton even had help getting his victims to come all the way out to Port Coquitlam. He often had female acquaintances like Dinah Taylor, who go into women's shelters and talk them into coming back with her by promising drugs or money. When Willie had been injured during his attempted murder of Wendy Eistetter, Dave Pickton paid for these women to bring prostitutes to the farm for his brother to sleep with. No one gave it much mind when these women never came to visit again. Even though all of this was well known, it would still take law enforcement until 2002 before looking into the murderous pig farmer. The near-intentional ignorance of Vancouver police left many members of the public frustrated. Despite newspaper articles, protests, and families filing report after report, law enforcement continued to rebuff the idea that these women were missing at all. Complaints fell on deaf ears as politicians commented that the decrease of these sex workers meant less criminal activity in the downtown East Side. Even the most vocal among these vulnerable women were not safe from Pickton's sick desire to kill. Serena Abbotsway had been a well-known face among the streets of Vancouver for years. She participated in the Women's Memorial March, as well as countless other protests. Shortly after being brutally attacked by a John, she still made an appearance at one of these demonstrations to speak out. While there, she had been interviewed by a reporter about if she was afraid of participating in the sex trade.
I don't like the way the guy is, and I won't go with him.
Perhaps her confidence in her ability to take care of herself was her downfall, as only a few weeks later, Serena would be counted among the missing. While the police seemed to blatantly disregard the crisis occurring in their own city, the illegal activities happening on the Pickton farm were known to some extent to officials. Even politicians and law enforcement had frequented parties hosted at Piggy's palace. So in February of 2002, when Scott Chubb informed the RCMP that he had personally seen illegal guns in Pickton's trailer home, it got the attention that the missing women could never garner. It was a rookie RCMP officer, untainted by politics and negligence that had plagued police until this point, who would make the startling discovery of what really became of Vancouver's vanishing sex workers: an asthma inhaler. On February 5th, officers raided the pig farm. In addition to several illegal and unregistered guns, they found other compelling items on the property. The rookie saw the inhaler with Serena Abbotsway's name on it and recognized her as one of the women reported missing. As well, blood evidence of another woman, Mona Wilson, was found soaked into a mattress in Willie's trailer. It was clear that there were more sinister things to be found than just illegal firearms. Police would now be unable to ignore what was really going on at Willie's farm. Pickton was arrested on weapons charges but was released on bail. He was kept under surveillance and forbidden from returning to the farm while a second warrant was issued and police began a thorough search of the premises. Officers scoured every inch of the Pickton farm looking for evidence of the missing women, and they found it. Bones and teeth were found buried all over the property. A bucket was found in a workshop freezer holding the partial remains of Andrea Joesbury. Some women's skulls were cut in half for burial, their hands and feet stuffed inside the bisected skulls. Marnie Frey's jawbone was found buried right beside the barn, and the hand bones of Georgina Papin were found in the pig pen. Aside from the remains, investigators also found a loaded .22 revolver with a large, spiky black sex toy over the barrel, which contained both Willie and one of the victims' DNA. In a videotaped recording played during his trial, Pickton claimed to have attached the sex toy to his weapon as a makeshift suppressor. Also found were boxes of .357 Magnum ammunition, night vision goggles, 2 pairs of faux fur-lined handcuffs, a syringe with 3 milliliters of blue liquid inside, and Spanish fly, a dangerous aphrodisiac. Among the contents of a garbage can found in Pickton's slaughterhouse were some remains of Mona Wilson. This was clear evidence of Willie's opinion of the women he had murdered. Officials were so shocked at what had been uncovered that excavations continued through November 2003. Police took special care in cataloging all of the evidence, not going to trial until 3 years after the initial raid. More than a decade after his crimes had begun, the dark deeds of Robert Pickton had been dragged into the light. The full depth of Willie's depravity became clear while the investigation was underway. Allegedly, Willie liked to grind up some of the meat of his victims and mix it with pork. He would then sell the meat to unsuspecting people, give it out to friends, as well as serve it to the patrons at Piggy's palace. The remains of one of his victims, Marnie Lee Frey, was said to have been served at a party hosted on the Pickton farm. A party which 2 of Marnie's cousins had attended themselves. The horrifying information was made public that Robert Pickton liked to dispose of the remains of his victims by feeding them to his pigs. Pigs are omnivores and opportunists, so it is not uncommon for them to eat carrion and small animals. British Columbia's Provincial Health Office issued a statement confirming that some of the meat produced for consumption by the Pickton farm had been contaminated with human remains. The method of disposal and destruction of the bodies made it extremely difficult to say just how many women died on the farm. When it was all said and done, and after years of continued investigation, Robert Pickton was charged with the deaths of a total of 27 women. The trial began on January 30th, 2006, and Willie pled not guilty to all counts. On March 2nd, one of the 27 counts was rejected due to a lack of evidence. For procedural reasons, the judge hearing the case decided to split the charges into 2 separate trials. He felt that attempting all 26 counts at once would put an unreasonable burden on the jury and increase the possibility for a mistrial. It was finally time for Pickton to answer for the crimes that he had committed. While Pickton was being held in jail, he shared a cell with an undercover RCMP officer he believed to be another detainee. In the course of their conversation, Pickton said he had murdered a total of 49 women.
That's what I was talking about. Yeah.
He freely talked about how a rendering plant is the perfect way to dispose of a body. It seemed that Pickton reveled in being able to share all that he had done. Despite the overwhelming amount of evidence, Pickton was only tried and found guilty of 6 counts of murder. In even further insult, he was only convicted of second-degree murder, the jury not being convinced that he had forethought in committing his crimes. However, after hearing 18 victim impact statements, the judge chose to sentence Pickton to life with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum punishment for second-degree murder and equal to the sentence which would have been imposed for a first-degree murder conviction, as well as the longest sentence available under Canadian law. Many families of the victims of the other 20 women would be crushed when prosecutors decided not to pursue charges for the other murders. A spokesman for the prosecution reasoned by stating that, quote, "The branch has taken into account the fact that any additional convictions could not result in an increase to the sentence that Mr. Pickton has already received." This statement meant very little to the loved ones of these victims. Even though other individuals such as Dave Pickton, Dinah Taylor, and a farmhand named Pat Casanova were all implicated in Willie's crimes, charges were not pursued against them either. The case ended with a whimper, with numerous other women who lost their lives at the hands of Robert Pickton and potentially a few others not seeing justice, and they likely never will. In 2016, Willie was able to smuggle out a manuscript with the help of another inmate. It was an autobiography titled Pickton, in his own words. The book sold briefly on Amazon for $14.95. In it, Pickton claimed his innocence, accusing the RCMP of making him the fall guy for the deaths. Some reports say he went into detail in his writing about how the body parts of women found on his farm were in cars he had bought at a police auction, and claimed that blood from one victim police found on a mattress was just spilled wallpaper glue. Pickton insinuates that the Hells Angels was behind some of the killings. Due to public outrage, the book was pulled, and none of his claims were ever investigated. Failure to investigate may as well be the summary of Robert Pickton's story. In the end, the sordid tale of the pig farm killer is left with a bitter taste. How many still missing met their fate on the Pickton farm? How many murdered women will not have their killer face any consequences for what he has done? How many could have been saved if more attention had been given to the victims and to the witnesses who were just written off due to their involvement in the sex trade? Perhaps most importantly of all, was anyone else involved, helping Willie in committing these atrocities, who have remained free to continue to feed their deadly bloodlust? As law enforcement seems content on burying this case as Pickton buried his victims, it's possible that we will never know, and justice will remain elusive to those who deserve it most. Thank you for watching this 2-part episode of Serial Killer Files. Post in the comments with your opinion on this case. Do you think Robert Pickton was working alone? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you again. This episode of Seriously Strange is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Rob, what the hell is an ExpressVPN? I'm glad you asked. The internet is full of snoops, hackers, and leaks. Every single day there's always another data breach or some other violation of people's internet security. Passwords, credit card information, and other critical aspects of your everyday life are at risk. ExpressVPN, however, is like a superhero. By going to the description below to expressvpn.com/Gavagan, you can get ExpressVPN and find out how to get 3 months free on top of it. Once you have it, it's super easy to set up and use. Just by hitting a single button, you can turn it on, which is way better than I am with women, and you can start protecting yourself. Without a VPN, also called a virtual private network, your internet browsing data can be tracked by your internet service provider, your cell provider, ad companies, and hackers, and other data, such as your credit card information, is wide open to a lot of rather unsavory people that may get a hold of your credit card info and use it to buy things like nuclear warheads. ExpressVPN encrypts your internet data with the push of a button, and it prevents others from obtaining your information over a network, especially if you're somewhere like a public place. Or maybe porn sites just freak you out. These are the times that I use it, even though I have it turned on most of the time. But keep in mind, there are people out there that specialize in stealing data, and they could swipe your passwords right out from under you. Even if your password is super complex, like password 12345 like mine is, it doesn't matter. They can snag it along with other data that, if stolen, will change your life in a horrible way in minutes. Don't you deserve to be protected while you're online? ExpressVPN has the fastest speeds, 24/7 customer service, has server locations in 94 countries, and can be used via Windows, iOS, Android, Mac, Linux, and more. So take back your internet privacy today with the best damn VPN provider out there, ExpressVPN. Thanks for listening. Be sure to press the subscribe button on screen and then hit the notification bell, or else YouTube probably won't tell you when I've uploaded a new video. That's just how it works, unfortunately. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.